The air inside the Copper Creek Bank was thick with the scent of old paper leather and the faint metallic tang of coin. It was a stagnant heat, trapped within 4 thick adobe walls that offered little respite from the Arizona sun climbing toward its zenith. Lucas Reed stood at the teller's cage, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow across the polished wood floor. He pushed a small canvas bag of money across the counter, the jingle of currency a meager sound in the quiet room. For the account of the Double R Ranch, he set his voice a low drawl that seemed to absorb the silence rather than break it. The teller, a young man named Peterson, with a nervous twitch in his left eye, nodded and began to count. Lucas's attention drifted. His thumb and forefinger found the familiar shape of the silver locket in his vest pocket. He drew it out, its surface cool against his calloused skin. The chain coiled in his palm as he opened the clasp. Inside, the miniature portrait of his late wife, Sarah, smiled out at him, her eyes bright with a life that had been extinguished 4 years ago, along with that of their infant son. He traced the delicate curve of her jaw, a familiar ritual of remembrance and pain. She had given him the locket the day they were married, a promise of forever that the unforgiving land had broken. The sharp, splintering crack of the bank's front door being kicked open shattered the afternoon calm. "Nobody move." The command was a raw-throated bellow. 3 men spilled into the room, their faces hidden behind dirty bandanas. Dust and blinding sunlight billowed in behind them. The man in the lead held a Colt Peacemaker, its barrel sweeping across the room with practiced menace. The other 2 fanned out, one covering the half-dozen customers and the other vaulting over the counter with brutish agility. Lucas's hand closed instinctively around the locket, his knuckles white. Every nerve ending screamed, his body tensing with the coiled stillness of a predator. He was no stranger to violence, but this felt different, a violation of the fragile peace he had tried to build for himself in the wake of his loss. Peterson let out a strangled cry as the outlaw on his side of the counter shoved the muzzle of a pistol into his ribs. "The safe, open it now." The lead robber stalked toward the customers huddled against the far wall. On the floor, wallets on the floor in front of you. His gaze fell on Lucas, who hadn't moved. He was still standing, his expression a mask of cold fury. "You deaf mister," I said on the floor, the outlaw snarled, taking a step toward him. Lucas's mind worked with chilling clarity. 3 men. 2 focused on the money, 1 on the customers. His hand still clutching the locket was his only shield. He slowly raised his other hand in a gesture of surrender. "Just take what you want and go," Lucas said, his voice dangerously level. The outlaw laughed, a grating sound. He saw the glint of silver in Lucas's fist. "What you got there, friend? Something shiny for me." He lunged his free hand, grabbing for the locket. Rage primal and absolute erupted in Lucas's chest. He moved with a speed that belied his size. He brought his elbow up hard, connecting with the man's jaw. The outlaw staggered back, spitting a curse. In the same motion, Lucas pivoted, but the man was faster than he looked. He recovered, swiping the locket from Lucas's loosened grip. The delicate chain snapped. "Give it back," Lucas growled, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. For an answer, the outlaw raised his pistol and brought the butt down in a vicious arc toward Lucas's head. Lucas dodged the blow, glancing off his shoulder, but the force sent him stumbling. Before he could recover, a shot rang out. It wasn't aimed at him. Peterson, the teller, crumpled behind the counter, a dark stain spreading across his white shirt. "Enough playing," the man at the safe shouted. "We got the money. Let's go." The leader, clutching the silver locket, backed toward the door, his eyes still locked on Lucas. He gave a mocking little wave with the hand holding the locket before disappearing into the sun-bleached street. His accomplices followed, firing a wild shot into the ceiling that sent plaster raining down. And then they were gone. Silence descended once more, heavier, now laced with the acrid smell of gunpowder and fear. Lucas pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the throbbing in his shoulder. He knelt beside the teller, pressing his hand against the wound. It was high in the chest, bleeding badly. Peterson was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. "Hang on, son," Lucas said, his voice tight. "Just hang on." His eyes scanned the floor. Amid the scattered papers and fallen plaster, something caught the light. A single gleaming brass bullet casing. He picked it up. It was unusual, the base stamped with a small stylized raven, not a standard army or commercial load. It was a custom mark, a clue. He slipped it into his pocket as the town doctor rushed in, his black bag swinging. The hunt had already begun. The locket was more than silver and glass. It was the last tangible piece of a life that had been stolen from him. And he would get it back. The silence of the train platform settled heavily around Wilhelmina Dawson, as she stood alone with her trunk abandoned in the shadow of the afternoon sun. The locomotive that had carried her 2,000 miles from Boston had already departed, its mournful whistle, a fading echo of her collapsed hopes. The letter of rejection clutched in her hand was a cruel, impersonal testament to her failure. Mr. James Walton had taken one look at her as she descended from the carriage, and without a word, had an emissary deliver the note. She was too plain, it implied her manner too direct, not the docile creature he had envisioned for his bride. Copper Creek, Arizona Territory, 1883. It was supposed to be her new beginning. Now it felt like the end of the world. The station master, a kindly man with a weary face, had offered a sympathetic glance before retreating into his office, leaving her to the mercy of the relentless heat. "What now?" she whispered to the shimmering air. Her navy traveling dress, once the epitome of Boston propriety, was limp with dust. At 23, she was an ocean of miles from home, with $12 to her name and a future as barren as the landscape before her. The clatter of boots on the wooden platform made Willa stiffen. She squared her shoulders, refusing to let anyone in this harsh, dismissive place see her tears. "Ma'am, you waiting on someone?" The voice was deep with a slight drawl that marked him as local. She turned to face a tall man in dusty range clothes. A worn leather vest covered a faded blue shirt, and denim trousers were tucked into scuffed boots. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but she could make out a strong jawline darkened with stubble and eyes the color of a stormy sky. There was a fresh bruise high on his cheekbone and a tightness around his mouth that spoke of recent trouble. "No," she answered, her voice steadier than she felt. "It appears I have been left behind." He stepped closer, his gaze assessing her, not with judgment, but with a weary curiosity. "You the mail-order bride for James Walton?" he asked, his tone flat. Heat rose to her cheeks. "I was. It seems Mr. Walton found me lacking upon inspection." She held up the crumpled letter. "He has arranged passage back east on tomorrow's train." The man's mouth quirked in a humorless line. "Walton's a fool." He glanced at her trunk, then back at her face. His gaze lingered for a moment, and for the first time, Willa noticed the profound exhaustion etched around his eyes, a sorrow that seemed too deep for a man who couldn't be much older than 30. "Name's Lucas Reed," he said, his voice rough, as if dredged from a place of great fatigue. "I run the Double R Ranch about 5 miles out of town." He gestured toward the dusty main street. "If you've a mind to stay the night before deciding, I have a wagon. I can take you to the boarding house." Willa hesitated. Sensibility screamed at her to accept a fine lodging and take the train home in defeat. But sensibility had gotten her here a pawn in her family's financial struggles. Before she could answer, the station master reappeared. "Train from Tucson's arriving early tomorrow, Miss Dawson. he called out. 9 o'clock sharp. Mr. Walton's already paid your ticket. Something inside Willa hardened. She had not crossed a continent to be returned like damaged goods. She looked at Lucas Reed, a man whose own troubles seemed to radiate from him like heat from the baked earth. Perhaps two solitary souls could offer each other a practical solution. "Thank you, Mr. Reed," she said, her decision made. "I would appreciate a ride." Lucas nodded, bending to grip the handle of her trunk. As he lifted it, he glanced at the station master. "John," he said, his voice carrying with deliberate clarity, "if anyone comes asking, my wife will be staying at the Double R from now on." Willa's breath caught. "I beg your pardon." Lucas met her startled gaze, his expression unreadable. "Just giving you options, Miss Dawson. You can still take that train, or you could consider a different arrangement." He lowered his voice, the sound meant for her alone. "I need a housekeeper. You need a place to stay. It's a simple bargain. What folks in town think is our business." The station master cleared his throat. "You taking her as your wife, Reed?" Lucas didn't break eye contact with Willa. "If she's willing." Madness. It was complete madness. And yet, what were her alternatives? Return to Boston in shame. She studied the man before her, searching for deceit in those storm-blue eyes. She found only a straightforward pragmatism, shadowed by a grief she couldn't begin to understand. He was offering not a romance, but an escape hatch, a chance to retain her dignity. "What would this arrangement entail exactly?" she asked, ignoring the station master's widening eyes. "My ranch needs tending," Lucas said, setting the trunk down. "Meals cooked, clothes mended, a household managed. In exchange, you'd have a roof over your head, food, and my protection." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "As for anything else, that would be entirely up to you. I'm not looking to force anything on anyone." "And if I wish to leave later," she asked carefully, "then I'll take you to the station myself." A small crooked smile touched his lips, though it didn't reach his haunted eyes. "Though I'd hope you'd give the Double R a fair chance." Willa thought of James Walton's callous dismissal. Then she looked at Lucas Reed, a man offering a clear, honest bargain. "Very well, Mr. Reed," she said finally. "I accept your offer of employment." As for the other matter, she added, a spark of her Boston-bred formality returning. "I believe we should maintain propriety before making such public declarations." A glint of respect appeared in his eyes. "Fair enough." He hefted her trunk again. "John," he said to the station master, "might be best if word gets around that Miss Dawson has found suitable arrangements. Don't want Walton thinking he can change his mind." The station master nodded slowly. "Sure thing, Reed. I'll tell folks your wife's arrived safe and sound." Lucas led the way to a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 bay horses. He offered his hand to help her onto the high seat. His palm was calloused, but warm, his grip firm. "You still have time to change your mind," he said quietly as she settled her skirts. "That train leaves tomorrow." Willa looked out at the dusty main street of Copper Creek. The town seemed to hold its breath, hushed and wary in the wake of the morning's violence she could now sense in the air. This wasn't the life she had expected, but her expectations had led her to this desolate platform. "No," she said, a new determination solidifying within her. "I came west to build a new life. I intend to do just that." Lucas climbed up beside her and took the reins. "The Double R isn't fancy, but it's solid." He clicked to the horses, and the wagon lurched forward, rolling through a town where faces watched from behind curtained windows. The usual buzz of activity was gone, replaced by small, tense knots of men talking in low voices outside the saloon and the sheriff's office. "They'll talk," Lucas said, his voice flat. Let them, Willa replied, lifting her chin. I would rather be the subject of gossip than an object of pity. Lucas gave her an appraising look. Walton really was a fool, he murmured almost to himself. The Double R was nestled in a shallow valley, its modest house of squared logs and stone looking both sturdy and solitary against the vast backdrop of Ochre Canyon walls. As they approached, a wiry, weather-beaten man in his 50s emerged from the barn. Pedro Lucas called out, setting the brake. Come meet Miss Dawson. She'll be staying with us. The man, Pedro Mendoza, approached, his dark, intelligent eyes taking in the scene with a quiet curiosity. He gave Willa a respectful nod. Welcome to the Double R, señorita. Pedro's been with this land since before my time, Lucas explained as he carried Willa's trunk to the covered porch. He paused at the door, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face. It's not what you're used to. It's been a while since a woman's touch was in this house. Mr. Reed, Willa said, her voice firm. I am not made of glass. I am accustomed to making do. He studied her for a moment, then nodded and pushed open the door. The main room was spare and functional, dominated by a stone fireplace where a pair of antlers was mounted. The air was clean, but carried a scent of wood smoke, old leather, and a loneliness so profound it was almost tangible. Why did you do it? She asked, stepping into the space that was now her refuge. Why offer a place to a complete stranger? Lucas set her trunk down and removed his hat, running a hand through his copper-colored hair. The gesture seemed to expose the raw weariness in his face. I needed a housekeeper. He said the words a shield. He hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the window that faced the distant mountains. And I suppose I don't like seeing people left stranded. The West is hard enough without being cast out by your own. He looked back at her, and she saw something flicker in his storm-blue eyes, a shared understanding of being left behind. There was a bank robbery this morning, he added, his tone clipped. A teller was shot. The town's on edge. It's no place for a woman to be alone and without protection. That explained the tension in town and the bruise on his cheek, the haunted look in his eyes. He wasn't just a rancher. He was a man who had stood in the path of violence and was still reeling from it. And you, she asked softly, were you there? He gave a curt nod, his jaw tightening. I was there. The finality in his voice closed the subject. He showed her to a small Spartan bedroom that had clearly been used for storage. I'll clear this out tomorrow, he promised. Supper's usually around 6. Nothing fancy. Left alone. Willa sat on the edge of the narrow bed, the day's events crashing over her. She was a housekeeper on a remote ranch, living with a stranger who was polite but distant, a man clearly wrestling with his own ghosts. She unpacked her few belongings, creating a small island of familiarity in the stark room. By the time the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, she had found the kitchen and, drawing on her limited experience, prepared a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and cornbread. When Lucas and Pedro came in from their work, their faces etched with the day's labor and lingering tension, Lucas paused in the doorway, surprised. You didn't have to do that. I prefer to be useful, Willa replied, setting plates on the solid wooden table. They ate in a silence that was not awkward, but heavy with unspoken thoughts. Afterward, as Pedro retired to the bunkhouse, Lucas remained at the table watching her. That name I gave you in town, Mrs. Reed, he began, his voice low. It was for your protection. A single woman living here. It would cause talk of a different, uglier kind. Within these walls, you're Miss Dawson, my housekeeper. Nothing more unless you decide otherwise. Willa appreciated his directness. And what of the world outside these walls? Let them think what they will. he set his gaze hard. If anyone gives you trouble, you tell me. I won't have you disrespected. The fierce, protective anger in his tone surprised her. It was the same fury she had sensed he must have felt in the bank, a deep-seated intolerance for injustice. That night, as Willa lay in the unfamiliar bed, the vast, silent darkness of the territory pressing in around her, she thought of Lucas Reed. He was a man of contradictions, hard and gentle, pragmatic and protective. She had come west seeking a husband and a home, and had found herself bound by a strange pact to a grieving man with secrets in his eyes. For the first time since leaving Boston, however, she did not feel like a victim of fate. She had made a choice, and in the heart of this wild, unforgiving land that felt like a victory. In the weeks that followed, Willa threw herself into her work with a quiet desperation. She scrubbed the house from floor to ceiling, banishing the dust and the lingering scent of solitude. She sewed curtains from calico, purchased on a tense, necessary trip to town, their cheerful pattern, a small rebellion against the starkness of the landscape. The vegetable garden, a neglected patch of weeds behind the house, became her personal battlefield. Under Pedro's wise tutelage, the desert gives water only to those who ask politely, "Señorita." She coaxed life from the dry soil, her hands becoming as calloused as Lucas's. Lucas remained a distant, watchful presence. He worked from before dawn until after dusk, his energy focused entirely on the ranch. And Willa suspected on the unresolved violence of the bank robbery. He would ride out for hours, returning with his expression grim, his jaw set in a line as hard as granite. He was hunting for something she knew, but he never spoke of it. Their evenings were spent in a comfortable, if reserved, silence around the supper table. He was a man of few words, his dialogue sparse and direct. But she began to learn the language of his silences, the subtle shifts in his posture that spoke of weariness, frustration, or a fleeting moment of peace. Their second trip to Copper Creek was a stark reminder of the world beyond the Double R. The town was still gripped by a quiet fear. The bank teller Peterson had survived, but would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. As Lucas loaded supplies into the wagon, Willa wandered toward the mercantile, her gaze drawn to a man standing on the boardwalk. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored Eastern suit, his silver hair gleaming in the sun. He commanded the space around him with an air of absolute authority, speaking to a group of townsmen who listened with deferential respect. "That's Silas Blackwood, Mrs. Abernathy, the dress shop proprietress," murmured, coming to stand beside Willa. "The judge, some call him, founded this town, owns the bank, the hotel, owns most of the county if you get right down to it." Blackwood's gaze swept the street and settled on Willa. He smiled, a polished, charming expression that didn't quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. He tipped his hat. "Mrs. Reed," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, a stark contrast to the rougher dialects of the West. "A pleasure to see you gracing our humble town. I trust your husband is treating you well." "Mr. Blackwood," Willa replied, inclining her head. "My husband is a good man." "Indeed he is," Blackwood said, his smile tightening fractionally. "Though some might say he carries the burdens of his father a bit too heavily. A lawman's legacy can be a difficult thing to bear." He turned his attention back to his companions, dismissing her as if she were of no further consequence. The cryptic remark about Lucas's father prickled at Willa. Later, as they rode back to the ranch, she saw James Walton, her former intended, in a heated, low-voiced conversation with one of Blackwood's known enforcers, a hulking man named Caleb. Walton looked agitated, gesturing angrily, while Caleb listened with a predatory stillness. The sight was unsettling, a hint of dark currents flowing beneath the town's placid surface. The first sign of trouble at the Double R came a week later. A 20-foot section of fence along the north pasture had been cut, the wires snipped clean. A dozen head of cattle were missing. Rustlers, Lucas said, his voice tight with fury as he repaired the damage. It's been quiet for a year. I don't like this. But it felt like more than common rustling. A few days later, Willa found the gate to her chicken coop broken, the hens scattered, and 3 of them killed, their bodies left behind as a clear message. It was petty cruelty designed to unnerve. That evening, the tension in the small house was palpable. Lucas sat at the table cleaning his rifle, the methodical click-clack of the mechanism the only sound. In his hand, he rolled a single unique bullet, casing the one from the bank. The raven stamp was clearly visible in the lamplight. "Tell me about your wife," Willa said softly, breaking the silence. "Sarah." Lucas froze, his hands stilling on the rifle. He looked up, his eyes clouded with a pain so raw it made her ache for him. He had never spoken her name. He took a slow, deep breath. "She was light," he said the word a struggle. "She saw the good in this land and people. She believed we could build something here." He looked down at his hands. The fever took her and our boy Thomas in the same winter. The locket, the one they stole, was all I had left of her. The confession hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge of shared sorrow. Willa understood now. His hunt wasn't just about justice for a bank robbery. It was a crusade to reclaim the last piece of his heart. The A crisis arrived in the form of an orphaned calf its mother lost during a difficult birth. Lucas was ready to put the animal out of its misery, a practical, if harsh, rancher's decision. "No," Willa insisted, kneeling beside the trembling creature. "Let me try." For 3 days and nights she fought for the calf's life, feeding it with a bottle, sleeping in the barn on a bed of hay. Lucas watched her, his skepticism slowly turning to a grudging admiration. On the 3rd morning, the calf stood on its own wobbly legs and nudged her hand, looking for milk. Lucas found her there, her dress stained with dirt and milk, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes shining with triumph. "You've got a stubborn streak, Willa Dawson," he said, a ghost of a real smile touching his lips. "I believe it's called determination, Mr. Reed," she replied, her voice tired but firm. He knelt beside her, his large calloused hand gently stroking the calf's back. Their shoulders brushed. The brief contact sent a current of unexpected warmth through her. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't hide, "for not giving up on him." He wasn't just talking about the calf. In that moment, the wall between them crumbled. He saw her not as a housekeeper or a convenient wife, but as a partner, a woman with a strength that matched his own. And she saw him not as a grieving recluse, but as a man capable of profound gentleness, a man worth fighting for. The loneliness that had permeated the house began to recede, replaced by the tentative shoots of something new, something that felt perilously like hope. The hope was short-lived. The final, undeniable proof that they were under siege came with the poisoning of the well. Pedro discovered it at dawn, and the water tainted with a foul, oily substance, a dead coyote floating near the edge. It was a declaration of war, an attack not just on their livestock, but on their very survival. "This is Blackwood," Lucas stated, his voice devoid of all emotion, but a chilling certainty. He stood by the contaminated well and the rising sun casting his face in stark relief. "This isn't about cattle anymore. It's about the land. He wants us gone." But why? Willa asked, her heart pounding with a cold fear. "He owns everything else." "Because he doesn't own this." That night, Lucas didn't sleep. By the flickering light of a single lantern, he tore through an old trunk containing his father's belongings, letters, journals, and official documents from his time as a territorial lawman. Willa sat with him, handing him bundles of yellowed paper, watching the grim procession of history pass across his face. Hours later, near dawn, he found it. An old folded property deed, its ink faded but legible. It was the original survey and claim for the land that was now the Double R. And at the bottom, listed as the original claimant, was a name that made the air in the room go cold: Elias Blackwood. Silas Blackwood's father, Lucas, breathed his finger tracing the name. He picked up another document, a legal notice of foreclosure. My father. He was the lawman who served the foreclosure. Elias Blackwood had overextended, taken loans from the bank he couldn't repay. He lost everything. Lucas read from a brittle newspaper clipping. Elias Blackwood was found dead in his hotel room of a self-inflicted wound, leaving behind his only son, Silas. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't business. It was a decades-old vendetta. Silas Blackwood wasn't trying to buy the ranch. He was trying to reclaim what he believed was his birthright, and to destroy the son of the man he blamed for his family's ruin. Suddenly, the unique bullet casing Lucas had kept seemed more significant than ever. He retrieved it from a small box on the mantel and compared it to a handful of old tarnished casings from his father's trunk. They were identical. The same custom load, the same stamped raven. My father led a group of regulators before he was a marshal, Lucas said, his voice hollow. They had their own ammunition made. A private mark. The implication was staggering. The man who had stolen Sarah's locket, who had shot the teller, was connected not only to Blackwood, but to his own father's past. Armed with the terrible truth, Lucas rode into town. He found Blackwood on the veranda of his hotel, sipping coffee, as if he were king of all he surveyed. Lucas didn't waste time with pleasantries. He walked straight up to the table and dropped the deed and the bullet casing onto it. This stops now, Lucas said, his voice low and shaking with controlled rage. Blackwood looked at the items, his charming facade melting away, to reveal the cold, predatory ruthlessness beneath. He picked up the casing, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. A legacy, wouldn't you say, Mr. Reed, passed from father to son? He leaned back, his eyes glinting. Your father took my home, my name, my future. He left me with nothing but a thirst for vengeance. I have spent my life rebuilding my father's empire, piece by piece. Your little ranch, my ancestral home, is the final piece. The bank robbery, Lucas said, the realization dawning. That was you. You wanted the locket. A sentimental trifle. Blackwood sneered. I wanted to see if you had your father's fire, to see what you would do to get back something you loved. It seems you do. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I'm a reasonable man. I'll give you $1,000 for the deed. A pittance, I know, but more than you'll get when my men burn you out. Take the money, take your woman, and disappear. Or stay, and I will bury you both on the land that should have been mine. Lucas stood his ground, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt. This land is mine. I worked for it. I bled for it. And I will not be driven off it by you or any of your hired guns. A pity, Blackwood said, sipping his coffee. I do so hate unnecessary bloodshed. Lucas returned to the ranch with the weight of Blackwood's threat heavy on his shoulders. He explained everything to Willa, holding nothing back. He expected fear, perhaps even a plea to accept Blackwood's offer and leave. Instead, he saw the same stubborn determination that had saved the orphaned calf shining in her eyes. This is our home, Lucas, she said, her voice unwavering. We don't run. They knew they couldn't fight Blackwood's army alone. Lucas's plan was desperate. He entrusted Pedro with their fastest horse and a carefully written letter detailing Blackwood's crimes, addressed to the territorial marshal in Tucson. It was a 3-day ride, a slim chance at best. Vaya con Dios, mi amigo Lucas said, clasping the old rancher's shoulder. "I will not fail you, patron," Pedro replied, his expression grim. He galloped away, a lone rider disappearing into the vast, indifferent landscape. For the next 2 days, Lucas and Willa worked feverishly, transforming the ranch house into a fortress. They boarded up windows, leaving only small slits for firing. They stockpiled water and ammunition. They moved the livestock into the defensible box canyon behind the house. They worked as a seamless team, their every action communicating a shared purpose, a silent vow of defiance. In the quiet moments, a new and profound intimacy grew between them, forged in the crucible of shared danger. They were no longer a man and a woman, bound by a practical arrangement, but a husband and wife united against a common enemy, ready to make their stand. The attack came on the 3rd day, just before dusk. A blood-red sun bled across the horizon, silhouetting the dozen riders who crested the ridge overlooking the ranch. They did not charge. They were methodical, confident. Silas Blackwood sat on a fine black stallion in their midst, an emperor directing his legions. The first volley of shots splintered the log walls of the house. Lucas and Willa returned fire from their fortified positions, the roar of Lucas's rifle and the sharp crack of the smaller carbine she wielded echoing in the enclosed space. The air grew thick with gunpowder. The siege lasted for hours, a deadly exchange of fire under a sky filled with cold, indifferent stars. Lucas and Willa fought with a desperate, synchronized rhythm, reloading for each other, calling out warnings, their fear burned away by the cold fury of protecting their home. But they were outnumbered. As the moon rose high, Blackwood changed his tactics. A flaming arrow arced through the night, thudding into the dry roof of the barn. Flames erupted, licking at the night sky, casting a hellish, dancing light over the entire valley. "He's trying to draw us out," Lucas gritted out, peering through his rifle slit. The fire was the diversion. Under the cover of the smoke and chaos, 3 of Blackwood's men crept toward the back of the house. A shattering of glass, the splintering of the back door they were inside. Lucas spun around, firing into the shadows of the kitchen. 1 man went down. The second lunged at him, a knife gleaming. They grappled, a desperate, grunting struggle for life. As they wrestled, the 3rd man grabbed Willa from behind his arm, clamped across her throat, a pistol pressed to her temple. "Drop it, Reed," the man snarled, "or your wife dies now." Lucas froze, his blood turning to ice. The man with the knife pressed his advantage, driving Lucas to his knees. The world narrowed to the cold steel against Willa's skin, her wide, terrified eyes locked on his. Blackwood strode into the house, stepping over the body of his fallen man, as if it were a piece of furniture. He surveyed the scene with a triumphant smirk. "It appears the siege is over. Such a shame about the barn." He nodded to his man. "Bring her." They dragged Willa outside, her hands bound. Lucas was hauled to his feet, his arms twisted behind his back. Blackwood mounted his horse, looking down at them. "I am a man of my word. I offered to let you leave. You chose this." He gestured toward the hills. "Take them to the old silver mine. We'll finish this on my land." The wind began to pick up, a low moan that whispered through the canyons. The air grew thick with dust, stinging their eyes. A sandstorm was brewing, nature's fury rising to meet the evil of man. As they were marched up the rocky path toward the abandoned mine, Lucas met Willa's gaze. He saw not defeat, but a flicker of the same defiant spirit he had first seen on the train platform. They were not broken yet. The entrance to the abandoned silver mine gaped like a wound in the mountainside. Inside, the air was stale and cold. Lanterns cast long, distorted shadows that danced on the damp rock walls. Timbers slick with moisture and rot groaned under the weight of the mountain. Outside, the wind howled the sandstorm, hitting with full force, a scouring, blinding wall of grit and fury. Blackwood shoved Lucas forward. "It was in this very mine that my father found the silver that built his dream," he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "And it was in a place just like this, a cheap, lonely room, that your father's justice left him to die." He turned to Willa, his eyes gleaming with a perverse satisfaction. "You know it was all supposed to be so much simpler. My nephew, James Walton, I arranged for him to bring a bride to Copper Creek. An educated woman from the East, someone who could manage a household, who would be grateful for the opportunity." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "The plan was for him to marry you, gain Lucas's trust, and take control of the Double R from within. No violence, no mess. But my fool of a nephew took one look at you and lost his nerve. Said you had too much spirit." Blackwood's face twisted in a sneer. "Your stubborn woman ruined it all, Reed. You forced my hand." The revelation was a final sickening blow. Every piece of their story, Walton's rejection, the convenient timing, had been a move in Blackwood's twisted game. From outside, a support timber near the mine entrance cracked with a sound like a gunshot, giving way under the storm's assault. A cascade of rock and dirt partially blocked the entrance. The mine was becoming a tomb. That was the opening Lucas needed. While all eyes were on the collapsing entrance, he slammed his head back into the face of the man holding him. The man grunted and stumbled, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Lucas drove his elbow back, broke free, and launched himself at Blackwood. The fight was a savage, desperate explosion of violence in the flickering lantern light. Blackwood was strong, fueled by a lifetime of hatred. But Lucas was fighting for more than revenge. He was fighting for a future. He was fighting for Willa. He landed a solid punch to Blackwood's jaw, sending him reeling back against a decaying support beam. The entire structure shuddered. Dust and pebbles rained from the ceiling. "The whole mountain is coming down," one of Blackwood's men screamed, scrambling toward the blocked entrance. In the chaos, Willa, her hands still bound, kicked backward with all her might, striking the knee of the man guarding her. He howled in pain, and she ran stumbling over the uneven ground toward Lucas. Blackwood roared and came at Lucas again, this time with a knife he'd pulled from his boot. The blade flashed. Lucas caught his wrist, their bodies locked in a stalemate. Above them, a large timber split, groaning in protest. "You will die on my land," Blackwood spat, his face contorted with madness. "No," Lucas grunted, twisting the man's wrist until the knife clattered to the floor. "You will face justice for what you've done." He slammed his fist into Blackwood's temple. The man crumpled unconscious. The ceiling above them began to collapse in earnest. Lucas grabbed the fallen knife, sliced through Willa's ropes, and pulled her toward the exit. He could leave Blackwood here, let the mountain dispense its own justice. It would be easy. It would be revenge. He looked at Willa's face, smudged with dirt, but alight with trust in him. He thought of his father's legacy of the choice between law and vengeance. "We're not leaving him." Lucas said, his voice ragged. He hoisted the unconscious Blackwood over his shoulder. "He's not worth it, but the law is." Together, they clawed their way through the collapsing tunnel, choking on dust as the mine imploded behind them. They burst out into the raging sandstorm, just as the entire mountainside seemed to sigh and settle, sealing the mine forever. Through the swirling wall of sand, they saw them, a posse of riders, their lanterns faint beacons in the gloom. At their head was Pedro, his face grim, and beside him the unmistakable figure of a territorial marshal. Justice had arrived. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a world scoured clean and unnaturally quiet. In the calm light of dawn, Lucas and Willa stood before the charred remains of their barn, the ranch house pockmarked with bullet holes, but still standing. It was damaged, but not destroyed, like them. The marshal had taken Blackwood and his surviving men into custody. The reign of the judge over Copper Creek was over. Before leaving, the marshal had returned a small object to Lucas, a silver locket recovered from Blackwood's possessions. Days later, after the most urgent repairs were made, Lucas took Willa's hand and led her to the small fenced graveyard on the rise behind the house. 3 wooden crosses stood there, silent sentinels of the past. 2 were for the ranch's previous owners. The third, smaller and newer, was for Sarah and their son Thomas. Lucas opened his palm. The silver locket lay there, its surface dented but intact. He opened the clasp, looked at Sarah's smiling face one last time, and then gently placed the locket on the wooden cross. It was an offering of farewell. He was honoring the memory of the woman he had loved, but he was no longer a prisoner of his grief. He turned to Willa, his storm-blue eyes clear and full of a love that was quiet, deep, and absolute. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. He was closing a chapter of his life defined by loss and choosing to begin a new one, a future he would build with the courageous woman standing beside him. A few weeks later, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the canyon walls, Willa placed her hand over his on the arm of the chair. "Lucas," she began, her voice soft but sure. "The doctor confirmed it when we were in town. We're going to have a child." He turned to look at her, his expression shifting from surprise to a profound, heart-stopping joy. A family, not one born of ghosts and vengeance, but of hope and survival. He drew her into his arms, his hand coming to rest gently on her stomach, a protective, promising gesture. Life, tenacious and beautiful, was taking root again on the Double R. It was the ultimate triumph, a testament to a love that had been forged in the crucible of the Wild West, a love strong enough to build a future on the very ground they had fought so hard to protect.